Howdy, everyone. Welcome to our workshop only night exclusive event. But to give you a little context on just me forgetting, I forgot to put the recap stuff in the channel because my computer is not very well built for video editing. And I tried to upload it or edit it twice and it crashed overnight both times. And then I got busy and forgot. So I put the automatic Zoom generated link in there so you can take a look at last week's session until I can get it uploaded to YouTube. So without further ado, I think it's Nathan and Jonathan tonight.
All right, howdy everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. All right, okay, let me present. Okay, all right, so today's workshop, we're gonna be talking about APIs. We're gonna give an introduction to some different technologies and why you would use an API. And then later on, we're gonna have Nathan actually demo our introduction to Express. And we're gonna go through some methods using Alpha Advantage API, which is gonna be the main API that we're gonna be using for the Stonks application. So let's get right into it. So just to start off, if you all haven't had any experiences with an API, it stands for Application Programming Interface. And basically what an API allows you to do is it mends two applications and it can help bring information from one application to another. So say you have a backend, which is storing your data in Firebase, right? You want to be able to access that data in one way or another. So you create an API in order to communicate between, let's say, your client, which could be a mobile app or a website. And that API is going to be fetching the data from the database and returning that data back to either your front end or client, or even another, maybe a backend as well. So a backend can consume another API in itself, right? So let me open up the chat here. Let me see if there's any questions. All right, sorry about that. Okay, cool. So why would you use an API? Well, one, it makes your life a lot easier as a developer, right? So not only if you make your own API, you can also consume APIs. So there's thousands of different open source APIs that you can go ahead and consume. So some of the popular ones are like Twitter or Facebook, right? So you can maybe implement the Facebook authentication into your app, and you can fetch a lot of different information about the user and create a user profile without having to get any of that information yourself. So if you were to implement something like Facebook Auth into your app, that requires the use of an API. It's a little bit more advanced since you have some different tokens and credentials to use, but at its core, it's an API, and that allows you to bring a lot of information into your application without a lot of the infrastructure. So that's kind of the idea of why you would consume an API or use one in general. And for our purposes in this project, we want to create an API that's going to consume the Alpha Advantage API. And that Alpha Advantage API is basically going to give us all the information that we want about the stocks and different information about what the prices are at. So we can then bring that back to our front end and display those to the user. So overall, it makes a lot of sense to create our own API in this case, because we also want to include some other data, and maybe the data that Alpha Advantage supplies isn't really formatted the way that we want, or it could be that it has too much information. So as you see later on today, we're going to be picking out certain parts of the data that it returns back. So yeah, before I go ahead and go into HTTP methods, is there any questions that I can answer? You can either put it in chat or speak up.
Can you explain one more time what an API is? Just briefly, please.
Sure. So at its core, an API is a way to send information from one application to another. And this application can be anything from a database or just another API as well, right? So there are many different ways to make an API. You can do it in practically any language. Today, we're going to be doing it with JavaScript. And then, so you can also use Python, Swift, even some smaller languages like Dart. Basically, any medium-sized language, as long as there's a library for it. You could also create your own if you wanted to, but that's pretty complicated to do. But there's support for various different languages that you could make your own API in. But yeah, did that answer the question?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so let's explore HTTP methods, and then hopefully that'll clear up a little bit more if some of you are still confused. So when you're creating an API or you're consuming an API, there are a couple of different types of HTTP methods that you make in order to actually interface with that API, right? So one way or another, you're going to have to send a request to that API in order to either send it data for it to do something or retrieve data. So the first one we're going to look at is a GET request. And this is the most common type of HTTP method that you'll see within an API. And we'll go over like some sample documentation later, and it'll become very clear of when a request is a GET or a POST. But just to give a little bit of an overview, a GET request is basically retrieving information from the API, right? So maybe let's say you're using the Twitter API and you want to retrieve the information for a certain user, all of their tweets, maybe, right? So you're going to make a GET request to Twitter to a certain endpoint. And when I say endpoint, an endpoint is basically the URL that you're going to be hitting on the Twitter API. So let's say the URL is going to be api.twitter.com/user/tweets, right? That's going to be the endpoint that you're going to hit in order to get the tweets for that specific user. And you might have to put the user ID into that URL. But once you send that request off, what it's going to retrieve is it's going to go into the Twitter API. And since all of this is kind of abstracted away, you don't really know what it's doing in the backend, right? Because all that information is kind of private. So it's going to fetch in their databases the tweets for those users. It's going to format it a certain way, and then it's going to send it back to you, and you'll be able to get all that information for that user, right? So there's many different GET requests that you can do for like the Twitter API, and that's kind of the most common one you'll see. Then right after that, we have POST. This is basically if you want to submit data. So if we're going off the Twitter example, right? If you were, let's say, making a kind of Twitter clone, you would make a POST request to the Twitter API if you wanted to submit a tweet, right? So if the user creates a tweet and then they go ahead and press the tweet button, you're going to send a POST request to their API to say, here's the description of what that tweet contains. This is the user that made it, and this is the date that they created it at. And then you'll go ahead, send all of that metadata over to them, and then it'll update in their database in the backend. And then once you go to your homepage and refresh it, that tweet is then now in the database. And then when you refresh the page, right, you're going to be making another GET request to refresh all of the tweets that are in the that are on the page, and it's going to retrieve the latest information. So those are kind of the two most common API requests that you'll be seeing. Now, to get into a little bit more complicated, you have put. So put request is basically replacing data in a certain location. So let's say you have a Facebook post, right? I know you can't edit tweets, but let's say in the future they add an edit button, right? If you were to edit the tweet content and completely change it, but a whole new thing, you could submit a put request in order to change the contents of the tweet. So you would say, okay, for this specific tweet, we want to replace the description to be this new string, right? So then it's going to go into the database for that specific tweet, and then it'll change the entire description for that tweet. Patch is a little bit similar, but it's a lot more specific. So let's say you have a specific object on that, maybe a database that you want to modify, but you don't want to replace the entire object. Maybe it's just a specific piece of data within that object. Then you could say, okay, maybe I want to change the time that this is posted, or a specific word within the tweet, and then it will go ahead and modify that on the for the API there. And then delete is pretty straightforward. You can go ahead and delete data. If I made a delete request for a tweet, then it will just go into the API, probably go ahead and delete that from the database, and then it's gone. Once you refresh it, it's not going to show anymore. So from there, I want to talk a little bit about, so we know how to make the request, right? So how exactly is that information being returned to us? So once the API has received your request, it's going to gather all the information that it needs in order to return it. And in the documentation, it's going to tell you how exactly it's going to return that back to you. And usually there's two different types of request return types that you can get. One is called XML and the other is called JSON. So XML is going to be a lot less common. It's pretty rare now actually to see in high usage APIs, but you'll see XML and some other types of projects, especially if you do something like mobile development. XML is a very popular type of file if you're doing like Android, when you're creating some different info files, things like that. Sure says .NET. Yeah, so it's basically just a series of tags, like keys and tags. So you can see here, it's just specifying like a list of employees with the name James Kirk and age 40. So it's kind of hard to parse, but you can read through it, and then if you wanted to use XML, you go ahead and parse through this, maybe turn it into a list of employee objects and things like that, right? So it would return this structure here of tags and content in that way. But by far the most common, especially when you're using standard APIs, you're going to get back JSON, right? And this is a lot more easy to read. What it's basically is, it's very similar to a Python dictionary if you've ever seen one, but it's not exactly one of those. It's just a series of keys and values. And JSON can be returned in either these bracketed form or an array, right? So here we have these brackets, and then the first object within the JSON returned is this string called EMP info, right? Employee info. And that's the key here. So the key, if you were to kind of script through or search for a specific object within this JSON, you would go ahead and look up, the literal word EMP info, and then the value that it's going to return is another object there. Whoops. Right. And then you can go ahead and parse through these employees and gather all of these and potentially make it into objects. And yeah, I guess I'll stop. If there's any questions, please. Sorry. We'll take a minute for questions. Okay, no questions.
What's hey Jonathan, really quick.
Yeah.
Would you do you guys talk about Postman in?
Yeah, we'll get to Postman.
Okay, just wanted to make sure because that's the easiest way to.
Sure. Okay, so yeah. So now we're going to do some quick exploring of the API that we're going to be using for this project. We're going to be using Alpha Vantage. And if you want to go to this URL here, I can paste it in chat real quick, I think. You can kind of follow along if you want. So this is going to be the API that we're going to be using. Oops. All right, and if you go to that link, it's going to take you here. And this is very similar to any kind of good API documentation that you'll see in the future. It's got basically a series of different endpoints that you can hit here. And then you can go and explore what those endpoints require for you to actually call it. So if I go into one of these, let's say daily, right? So this is an endpoint that we talked about earlier. So if you go down here, this is what you need to hit in order to make that request. And let's say you want to know what type of parameters or information that you need to provide in order to hit this endpoint. You can go up here into these API parameters, and it'll say, this is required and this is what you need to use to hit this endpoint. And then you also need to provide a symbol, right? And in this case, the symbol just means the actual ticker symbol of the stock that you want to check. So in here, in this example, it's checking IBM. You could replace this with TSLA for Tesla, or Apple, anything like that. And then it'll go ahead and change. It'll go ahead and query for that specific stock ticker value. And then there's some optional fields here that you can select for the type of data that we want. So you can see here by default, it's going to return JSON, but you can also return some different types like CSV if you want. And maybe you're doing a different project where you're using that CSV for some data analysis and you want that instead of JSON because it's a lot more useful. It's a lot easier to parse through for your specific use case. But for us, JSON is just fine. So we can kind of leave that out since it defaults to it. But yeah, that's kind of how this works here. So let's say we wanted to actually, test this here. You can see here that it requires an API key, right? And people can chat, Shrey put a link to how to actually sign up for an API key. It's completely free. You're just kind of like limited by rate. But what you would do is you can see here in this URL that I mentioned earlier, you can see the parameter for API key here. And instead of demo, you would put in your specific API key, which is going to be like a series of random letters or numbers. And you want to kind of keep that secret because if someone gets a hold of it, or if you put it online, there's bots constantly scanning for that type of thing, and then they might use up all your credits and things like that, right? So to test this, you could either run this in your own app that you make and then see what it returns in your console. But there's a really great app and useful resource called Postman, and it's available on Mac and Windows, pretty much anything that you use. And the way it works, I know it's kind of overwhelming, but basically all it does is it breaks down how to actually send any type of request to an API or any website for that matter, right? So you can see here that I just made a new request here. I made a folder here called Stonks ACC just to break it down. And I'm going to be getting the AlphaVantage daily request. So you can see here, there's a bunch of different types of requests that you can choose from. You can also get more complicated if you want with some authorization. So maybe if you do some Facebook auth or Google auth, or maybe we might eventually talk about Auth0. You can experiment with this, passing in tokens and doing that. So it's a very powerful tool, but it can also be very simple if you want it to be as well. So here you can see I just copied the URL that I gave us here for the example, and I pasted it into here. And you can see that I still have the demo here. For our purposes, it's going to work in Postman, but if you were to try this in production, it would give you some issues. It wouldn't actually return the correct information because you don't have an actual API key. So the API key can also sense what type of user you are. If you're actually on the web using an app, you won't be able to use this little demo thing here. So once I have that set, these are all defaulted here. You can see that the query parameters are actually taken directly from the URL. I haven't manually inputted these. I just pasted the URL here, and then it automatically parsed these out. So you can see that there's a parameter called function symbol and API key, and then it shows you the value here. So it's very, very nice, especially if you have really long URLs or complicated parameters that you need to input and you don't want to construct this URL yourself. You can just create your key values in the params tab, and then it'll all autofill that into the URL and construct that when you send the request. So one thing to note is you got to make sure that you have the right request type when you send this off. So this is going to be a GET request. And then I've already sent it off, but you can send it again. And then it'll return back this data here. So you can see that this is all the metadata that it returns. I sent it off with IBM, and this is going to be the daily prices returned. And it gives you all of this information here that I'm not going to scroll through, but it's just a bunch of values that the stock opened and closed at, and then some volume information as well, right? So that's kind of the basis of how to test an API without having to write any code. Because if you want to see if you're making your requests correctly, you can just go ahead and test it in Postman and make sure that everything that you're setting, such as your API key or values. If it returns correctly in Postman, then you know that you're using the correct parameters, and you just have to make sure that you convert that into whatever code you're doing. So if it's JavaScript, it might be a little bit different than doing it in Python, for example. And yeah, that's the basis of Postman. You should definitely download it. Again, it's free, and it's pretty easy to get started as well. And from there, I think we can go ahead and get into our code. So we have a branch set up on our GitHub Stonks backend called Apple Vantage Setup. And Nathan's going to be talking about that. And basically what this is, I think right now it's completed, but we're going to be going step by step now. And then at the end, it'll be kind of the completed version of this branch, which is currently up on GitHub. And then you can kind of go ahead and follow along what we're doing now. And then for our next week, we're going to be starting from this current state right now, which is this branch that we have linked. So it's kind of a one-off for this workshop since we're kind of starting from scratch, but we don't have like the empty one. But you can kind of see that our repository when Nathan starts is going to be pretty much bare bones, and we'll work up from there. But before I hand it off to Nathan, are there any other questions I can answer? Okay, if there aren't, Nathan, it's all yours.
All right, great. Thanks, Jonathan. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to let me share my screen first. All right. So right now we have, as I posted in the chat, we have this link to our GitHub repository, and you'll see that there's a bunch of branches, and check out Alpha Vantage Setup. So what we're going to do is, in this session of the workshop, we're going to figure out all the little bits and pieces of each of these files in this branch, and by the end of this workshop, we'll have recreated everything in this branch. So we're going to start out from basically nothing right now, and then we'll go back and add all these files in as we go along. So to get started, all right, so right now we have a really bare bones application. We just have a single file that has code, just index.js, right? And we covered this in the last workshop, but as a recap, just to like kind of an overview of what this is doing. So the first line is it's JavaScript's way of saying I want to pull in code that or other dependencies that I didn't write, but I want to use it anyway because I'm lazy. So Express, as you probably heard, is a library for Node.js for managing server runtime. So if you have a web application, this will make your life a whole lot easier. You don't have to write as much code, and it makes like your job much simpler. So that's what this does. It brings Express into scope so we can use it. And then this says, let's actually use Express. And then we get down to here, it says const port is equal to processing port or 5000. So what this does is it just, it tries to read a port number from the surrounding environment variables, or it'll default to 5000. So we'll cover what environment variables are in a second later, but for now, just treat this as like kind of like a magic incantation. And then same for these two. These are kind of like same defaults for when you're sending JSON within your requests and responses. Don't worry too much about what all the syntax is. Just focus on that it needs to be there for this to work properly. And then we get into like the actual backbone of our application that we have right now. So this is the most important function here. So we define an endpoint at the top level directory. So if you were to navigate to our website and you go to like the first slash, then this is what fires. And all it does is if you go to the top level directory of the slash, you'll get howdy back as a response. And what this does is it just automatically calls this code whenever the app is up and running. So like as soon as Express says everything's ready to go and it starts listening for requests, then it'll say we're ready to go listening on port, yada, yada, yada. So if we just type npm start, what should happen is it should say our app is running on some port, and we can go to our browser. So localhost 5000, right? So we go to localhost 5000, and as you can see, since we're at the top of the directory, so it's like implicit, right? So if you do a slash, it's the same thing. And we get our howdy, right? So now what we're going to do is we're going to stop running the app, and we're going to start defining a new endpoint for interacting with our AlphaVantage API. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to make a new file. So here, let me just copy paste this real quick. All right, so what this function will do is we just defined a new endpoint, and what it does is when you navigate to localhost and then you go to like /stonks, instead of seeing howdy, it'll start execute whatever code you have in that function instead of like our basic response. So this won't work just yet. We're still going to add more bits and pieces until it'll actually work. So don't try and run npm start for now because it'll break. So what does this do? So if we look in here, what's going to happen is you have this function that has two parameters, rec and res, and then it does something. So in Express, what you do is you define endpoints, and for each endpoint, you give it a function that takes two parameters, and these are the two parameters. So rec is short for request, and res is short for response. So rec, or the request, refers to the incoming request from the client-side browser, and it gives you a bunch of methods for interacting with the data that the client sent in. And then the response object will give you a bunch of methods for sending data back to the client once you're done doing all sorts of data processing. So what we're going to do first is we're going to look at the query string in our requested URL. So what a request string is, or a query string in URLs, is a way of passing data in a GET request to the server. And it always looks like this. So if I were to just do like a short little demo, it looks something like this. And then you put like a question mark, and then you do key value pairs. So key, like this is your first key, one key, and then equals your value, and then separated each pair with ampersand. So like key 2 equals value 2, and so on. And what we're doing is, for our application, we're going to define our format that we're going to expect is going to be something like this, and then our key, we expect a symbol, and then so the symbol, remember, is like that 4-lettered unique identifier for a stock, and the client, or the person who's using our web application, will pass in a symbol as the value of this key value pair. So like, for example, if you want to look up Tesla, you would type TSLA. And the way we implement that in code is, first we need to check this. So we'll look at this object first, right, the request object. And we're going to examine the query. So we're looking at everything after that question mark. And then we're going to look at the symbol. So Express is really nice because it'll take your query string and do all of the parsing for you. So everything is all ready to go for you. So all you have to do is make sure it's the right type. So we're just going to check, is this a string? And like, does it exist? And if the answer is yes, we're good. Otherwise, something's bad, and we say, try and fix your request. So once we jump in here, we're like, okay, everything's great. And now we have a potential symbol to try and look up. And what we're going to do is, so we have our symbol in this variable here, and then we're going to say, await Stonks API get Stonks. So we haven't defined this yet, but we're going to get to it. And the way we do that is we're going to separate this into a new file because it can get kind of cluttered. So we're going to make a new file called AlphaVantage. And in this file, what we're going to do is paste a whole lot of code, like a lot. So in this file, what we're going to do, the first line here is we're bringing in an external dependency called Axios. So Axios is a library where it helps you make requests. And usually, so Node has some built-in methods for doing this, but it's kind of hard and it doesn't handle a bunch of error cases on its own, so it makes it really unwieldy to work with. So we'll use Axios to take care of that for us. So everything is like less work on our part. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a class called AlphaVantage, and in this class, it's going to the constructor will take a single parameter, which is our API key, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, which says we're a valid user of the AlphaVantage API, and we'll define a single method called getStockInfo, where it'll take in some symbol, or it might not be a valid symbol, so that's where we get keyword, and then it'll try and actually talk to our API. So the way we do this is, this is the most important part here, this section right here. So first, what it does is we say axios.get, and then we pass our URI. So this is, the URI is this big thing right here. And if you refer to the documentation of AlphaVantage, you'll see that the way to get the information for a stock is by this really long black magic URL. And what we do is we say send a GET request there, and then once we get the server replies, it return only the first best match for that symbol. And then if something bad happened, just print it to the console and then return empty object. And then you'll see like this weird await keyword here. So whenever you send a web request, it takes time, right? And what to do to express that waiting in code, you need to put the await keyword there. Otherwise, you'll get these weird errors. And the reasons why are kind of out of scope here, but if you want to learn more, you can look at promises and the JavaScript event loop. But for now, just know that we need this await here to say we're waiting for something to happen. So we're just going to sit in our hands and do nothing until that something happens. So once we get our data from the request, we'll store in a variable, and then we'll check that we have certain fields defined in our data, and then we'll return the name, so the old name, and the actual like security name. So like instead of TSLA, we'll have Tesla, right? And now, oh crap. What we're going to do is, if you go back to our file, what we're going to do is we're actually going to run our application and see if it works. So there's a couple more things that we need to add. So let me just copy paste this stuff real quick. While I do this, are there any questions in chat? Am I going too fast? I can slow down if I need to. I don't see any questions or anything, so I'm going to continue. All right. I believe that is everything, and we also need to add our new file, right? Because we need to tell JavaScript that, hey, we made a new file, and we want you to look at it. So we'll have this extra require statement, and hopefully, thumbs crossed, if we do npm start, it'll just work. But this won't actually work because, if you run into this problem where you see like an equal sign here, and you see like this like nasty syntax error thing, you might not be running a modern enough version of Node, so you'll need to update your Node version. So in this case, I'm just going to use a more modern version like this. So now I'm using like a recent version. And
really quick, Nathan, is that one you had pre-installed or?
Yeah. So this is specific to my distro, like the computer I'm running right now. But if you attended, or you can look at the recap for the last workshop, the version we installed of Node should be more recent enough so that you don't get this bug. I'm just really lazy and I haven't updated anything on my machine. So just disclaimer.
Yeah, most people should not have this issue. If you're just working on projects that used some version of JavaScript that was before this current node, that's when you'd have to change it. But if you're just getting started, it wouldn't come up.
All right. So this will almost work, but not quite. So if we do npm start, everything will successfully work, right? It says app listening, and we go to here, and then if we try to go to stocks and then say like Tesla, this will just die, right? Because what we forgot to do is we forgot to provide an API key for talking to AlphaVantage. And since we haven't done that, AlphaVantage is like shutting us out and saying, we don't want to serve you because we don't know who you are. And what we need to do is we need to say, we actually have an API key, and we need to give that to AlphaVantage. So the way we're going to do that is, as you can see in index.js, we have these two lines of code here, where we're getting an API key from the process environment variables. And so there are two ways to go about doing this. And the first way I'm going to do it is I'm going to define an environment variable in my current shell session. So what is an environment variable? Well, all it is it's a variable that you can use like while you're typing commands in your terminal, and it'll last for the duration of your shell session. So for just like as an example, let me define an environment variable called greeting as howdy, or quotes, right? So if I want to access that variable, I can just say, let's say I want to print out what's inside it. You can see that I have howdy saved somewhere. And a program can actually look at these environment variables as well. So let's say I'm in JavaScript, right? I do process environment and then .greeting. It looks like it broke. Oh, because I only ran it because if you do this, it's temporary-ish. So that won't work, but when we set the next way we're going to set it up, it will work. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a file called config.environmentVariables, or .env, and we're going to say API key is equal to, and I'm going to paste in the ACC's private API key. I encourage you to actually go to the AlphaVantage website and get your own API key. But for demonstration purposes, we're going to use the one that we got as workshop officers. Give me a second to copy paste it. And
again, please just don't copy paste this key for
this
yourself.
is very valuable. So
just to hammer it in some more, if you ever use an API key, you must make sure that nobody else gets a hold of it. It's usually fine if nothing involves money. If something involves money, that's really bad. If you take away one thing from this, remember that.
Yeah, I have made the mistake of posting my Google Maps key on a GitHub repo and instantly getting like a ton of requests. And this was in a hackathon that I was just trying out. So like definitely make sure you don't post it on GitHub. That's the #1 thing you should make sure.
Yeah, definitely make sure you keep these safe, because your life, you will have a very bad time if you don't. So moving on, we've successfully defined our API key in a separate file. And what we're going to do is we're going to add one little line to make sure our config works smoothly. Give me a second. And like this. So we're going to add another library called .env, and it's just a little helper method for reading environment variables from files. And all we need to do is just paste this in, and hopefully, fingers crossed, this will work when we hit start. All right, and let's try looking up Tesla. So I can't see under my webcam. I think that's right. And as you can see, we get our successful data response back where it has our symbol, which we looked up in our URL query string, and we have our name value, which is Tesla Incorporated. I see the chat's saying something. Oh, okay, great. Are there any other questions right now? This is like a good stopping moment. I will take that as a no. So now we have kind of like the basic functionality of talking to an API. Like, however, it's like not quite like cohesive, or it feels kind of hackish. So we're gonna add one more thing for the purposes of debugging, because when this gets really big later, it'll help if we can see what's going on whenever someone responds to a request or whatever. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some middleware. So middleware is it's a really fancy name for like a really simple concept. All it is so here when we have like these, when we define these endpoints, we basically provide a function that reacts to a request or what that the browser makes, right? And sometimes we'd like to process the data that the client sends in, or the request that the client sends in, before we finally get to this endpoint. And middleware is what does that. It's just a couple extra functions that pre-process your request before it finally arrives at the endpoint. And to Express makes it really easy to add more middleware. We've actually already used some middleware. These functions are actually using middleware behind the scenes, which is really nice. And now what we're going to do is we're going to define our own custom middleware. So the way we do that is we're going to put this middleware in a separate file. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a logger. So anytime someone makes a request to our application, we want to see what the URL query string was, for, like, say, for debugging purposes or something. So we're going to create a new file called logger.js. And in this file, we're going to put the code for creating a new piece of middleware. So basically defining one more function, and that's it, and re-exporting it. So let me copy paste some more, and boop. All right, so in this file, the top line is, again, we're pulling in more dependencies because we love JavaScript, and everyone writes code already for us, so you can just copy paste theirs. It's great. So Moment is another JavaScript library that has to do with time, and it's really helpful for if you have like timestamps you want to parse, or you just want to figure out what time is it right now, and then like get a string out of that. And Moment gives you some really nice functions for figuring out what those strings are. Like if you wanted like the current time and like right now, you can easily make strings, and it just makes your life so much better. So what we have here is, so logger is a function that takes 2 parameters or 3 parameters, and it's really, the body of logger is really simple. All it does is a single basically print statement, and it has like this monster of a string formatting thing. So if you haven't seen these weird $ curly brace thingies before, it's just JavaScript syntax for concatenating strings together along with variables. So like let's say you wanted to write this in like a more familiar notation, you could do like rec.protocol and then plus and then just keep concatenating all the strings together. But that's like messy, so that's why we use this notation. So all it's doing is we're saying get the protocol of the incoming request, and then concatenate it to this, and then get the host of the request, so where the name of the person or the browser that sent the request, and the original URL is the same thing, and then we're tacking on a timestamp at the end. So we're saying, when did this happen? And all that just gets sent to send it out, and then we just call next here. So this piece of middleware is like a pipeline, right? So we get the request and response just like when we had, oh gosh, just like in our original definition of the Stonks endpoint, you have like your rec and res variables, right? These are the exact same thing. They just get passed on to the next thing eventually. But it's all happening beneath the scenes, so there's not really much you need to worry about because Express takes care of it for you. So we've done this, and we've said, okay, we print out our timestamps with anytime someone makes a connection, and now, oops, let me save. What we're going to do is, if you go to index.js, so this, we're going to import our logger, our middleware, so like this, and then the file name of the thing, right? So make sure I actually wrote that. Yeah. Okay, cool. So now loggers and scopes of the function we defined is all ready to go, right? This is now visible in the context of index.js. And what we're going to do is we're going to say app.news and one thing. I'm going to say just news bar log like this. And now what should happen is anytime we get a request, before it arrives at our handler for our endpoint, it'll print the timestamp and the URL query string of whatever the request was. So if I do this and start the application again, I then send another request. So I'm just going to refresh here. Hopefully, if I go to my terminal, as you can see, someone made a request and it gives us what their URL looked like, right? And it tacks on like when this actually happened, which is really nice for debugging later if you want to figure out what's going on. And with that, I think that is all I have to present. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute or drop in the chat. And I think that's all I have.
One thing that I do really often with JavaScript is, I don't know if most of the people that I've met use VS Code for coding JavaScript. And if y'all use VS Code, there's an extension called Prettier. I'll post the links in here after I speak. But via Prettier, what you can do is you can create a config file that can replace all of your quotes into text. What that will help you do is, or backticks as people call it. I call it text for some reason, but what that will help you do is make sure your code stays in the most like I guess formatable version ever, because you can use those $signs and the curly braces for putting in text and doing stuff with it at all times.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of auto formatting, especially for Prettier. Prettier is really great. VS Code is also really great. I don't know. I'm weird. I use terminal things. Sorry.
The only other thing I want to address, which I think we sort of touched on in the chat earlier, but I just want to get in the recording, for the like Express boilerplate code which you were showing earlier, where's the best place for someone to look for that when they're starting up an app?
Oh yeah, so if you go to the Express, I think they have their own website, Express, like go here, and then go to Getting Started, right, and it'll give you the stuff that you need for getting like a minimal app up and running. And the little extra stuff that we had, like the URL encoded JSON, we actually don't need this for this particular application. But later down the line, when you actually start doing more complicated things with databases, you do need this. But for now, it's kind of extraneous. It's just there for like future prep. But yeah, the documentation for Express will give you all of that and more to get the guide. They tell you all the little ins and outs of how Express works and how to like configure it to how you want it to work.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? I think that's it, right?
Yeah, I think that's good. Shrey, was there anything else you wanted to interject or any announcements? Actually, I have an announcement. If you don't have anything.
I just wanted to say, like, this looks super like technical and difficult. It's because it is. and we kind of went over it quickly. What I would do is after this workshop's over, go over to our GitHub, and we have already sent the links in here. We'll also put it in the chat. But I would go over each line of code and try and understand what it means, because JavaScript is a language where like there's a lot of ways to code stuff, and there's a lot of ways of including things and removing things. Like I remember Nathan went over promises at once. There's one way you can totally get rid of them, and there's another way you can include them. So there's various things you can do in JavaScript, and you should be aware of all of them. So keep going through the code, look up Node.js stuff online, Express.js stuff online, and if you have any doubts or any questions, email us or send us a Discord message, or whatever way you want to communicate with us, do that, because this is really hard to get into, but once you're in this zone, once you know how to do stuff, it's super easy to use.
Yeah, it definitely feels like, when I was working my first web projects, it feels like you're like putting together a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces could catch on fire and destroy the puzzle at any time. And as you like try stuff out, that puzzle becomes more and more familiar to you. It is not a like, oh, I understand this, and you instantly like can do it the same way forever. You're always going to get weird error messages, which might lead you to strange rabbit trails on Stack Overflow. That's just, what computer science is. Lots of very complicated puzzles, which link to other puzzles. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention from our announcement side of things is that if you missed our project sign-up deadline and are interested, there are a few projects open which are taking on some more members. I put an announcement in our announcements channel, and you can contact them if that sounds like something you are interested in. But yeah, any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. When do kind of the project starts? Because I know mine hasn't started yet.
Okay, sure.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask which project you're in.
Study Buddy.
So you're in the text channel, right, on the server?
Yes. You mean the Discord, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
on the Discord. So that's definitely, I think that's where most of the project managers are doing their sort of communication. And it looks like there are some messages in it, although this might have been from last semester. So yeah, the project managers should, okay, yeah, you messaged it like 50 minutes ago, so you know what's going on,
Yeah.
I think, right? Yeah, so they project managers are definitely still getting started up. I wouldn't expect a meeting like anytime last week. So yeah, I think it should be okay. If you're really worried, you can just reach out to the PM and talk to them, but yeah.
Yeah.
And are we gonna meet for the projects outside Mondays?
Correct. So Mondays is Alston's sort of little cutesy, whatever, cool guys group. Projects are completely separated and they are run by the PMs, and we project officers will oversee that. So if you have any complaints, you can come to us, but they should be completely separated.
So if the study buddy people don't get going in a bit, we'll probably start talking to them.
Yeah.
So you should hear from them pretty soon. Sorry for leaving you in the dark. I don't know when you sent that message, so I hope you haven't been waiting super long on that.
No, I've sent it a couple minutes ago.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we'll probably get in touch with them and see what's going on.
Perfect. I have a question. What major are you guys?
I'm computer science.
Nice.
I'm ESET, although I don't think that really. I'm assuming you're asking the people who are running the workshop, so.
Well, it's open to everyone,
I see.
And I'm a general engineer, so. Oh, sorry. Did I cut someone off? My bad.
Nah, Jonathan doesn't matter. It's fine.
Did you say you're mechanical?
I didn't even talk, bro.
I'm a general engineer because I'm a freshman, right? So
he's a freshman. He has to do
ETAMs. Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Good luck,
he just
dude.
has code in his brain. Like, I learned coding when I came to A&M, but he just knew it when he came.
Yeah. Well, so my first indication of how stacked Nathan was well, not besides the corn eating thing, which happened off the record, but he has Vim, just like straight up, just has Vim on his terminal. I didn't start using Vim until like my internship, like last summer. It's like that's crazy.
I still don't like Vim.
Vim is actually really nice. It's just that you just have to get into it, you know? It's like